Hello. Hello, everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this session called Planning Through to Action, Public-Private Collaboration for Adaptation Resilience. I'm Charmian Keynes. I'm a senior partner at BCG based in our London office, and I lead the work that we BCG do on climate adaptation globally. I'm here with my colleagues, Dave Sivaprasad, who you will see shortly, and Annika Zawadsky, who will be moderating the Q&A. To kick off this event, we've asked Her Excellency Razan Al Mubarak, who I suspect many of you have heard in the last few days. She's the high-level champion for COP28. She's done a very short video which sets a nice context for this discussion. So if you could possibly play the video.
I am delighted to welcome you to this important event on public-private collaboration on adaptation. While I regret not being there in person, I am confident in the rich and productive discussions that await you. We are at a critical juncture in addressing climate risks that threaten our lives, livelihoods, and ecosystems. The climate champions, with support from BCG, are spearheading efforts to meet the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda targets. Our mission is to make 4 billion vulnerable people resilient by 2030 by closing gaps in planning, in implementation, and in finance. There are encouraging signs of progress. 85% of countries have adaptation plans or strategies in place, increasingly incorporating nature-based solutions. Funding for adaptation is growing from both public and private sector, though there is still a significant shortfall, especially in developing countries. The private sector is stepping up, recognizing the need for resilience plans and scaling adaptation solutions. The crux of today's event is the power of public-private partnerships in driving transformative change in human, natural, and economic systems. You will hear from government leaders, funders, and private sector executives about transitioning from planning to action in adaptation efforts. I thank our panelists for their invaluable contributions and look forward to hearing about the outcomes of this session. I wish you all an engaging and fruitful event. Have a great event and see you all around COP28.
She always speaks so eloquently, doesn't she? So Her Excellency Razan has really explained why we're doing this. We want to talk about the how. We know the what. You don't need any of those facts and figures. We all know them. But we're at the foothills on adaptation, and we really need to accelerate. We did a session not dissimilar to this at COP27, so a year ago. And I think it really is fair to say, as Razan has said there, that awareness is definitely growing. So we all know mitigation is critical to secure our future. But I think increasingly people are realizing that adaptation is absolutely critical to secure our today. And whilst funding and financing vastly insufficient, as Razan says, it is beginning to flow. And in the work that we as BCG are doing around the world with government leaders, with private sector corporations, with financiers and DFIs, we're certainly seeing that there is action happening on the planning side. People are beginning to think about cost of inaction and therefore why they should create project portfolios to deliver adaptation solutions. I think one of our biggest observations, though, through the work that we do is that there is one critical unlock, and that unlock is public sector and private sector collaborating along the whole of that chain that you see on the screen in front of you. Sorry, panelists, you can't see that, but you have seen it already. And what we're going to do is to actually walk through the stages of that. This panel is going to focus on the first two, and then the second panel will focus on the second two of those blocks. But all the time, what we want to focus on is this public-private sector collaboration and how that can be an unlock. That, if you like, is a fundamental backbone that needs to play through to secure what we need to secure and to accelerate what, as I say, is just at the foothills. So we have a fantastic set of panelists today who are really at the forefront of adaptation. and who are going to share their thoughts on this. I also want to thank the audience because I know we have Mr. Kim from the South Korea government, and we have a number of other senior government leaders and large corporation senior folk as well. So, firstly, I am going to start with you. Whoa. Secretary Borge. So Secretary Borge is the Commissioner and Vice Chair of the Climate Change Commission in the Philippines government. And I think it's fair to say that the Philippines has been really quite progressive. It's one of the most vulnerable countries from an adaptation point of view, from a climate impact point of view. But you've been doing a lot of work to create a national adaptation plan, a really high-quality national adaptation plan. And I'm going to ask you two questions. The first question is how do you bring the best of, or how have you brought the best of climate science and data to support your decision-making and the planning that you're now doing? But then the second question is how are you mobilizing private sector in your planning and in the project portfolio that you're now developing?
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if 3 minutes will be enough to answer your question. But just by way of background, no? Again, the Philippines is identified as one of the most at-risk countries in the world. And understandably, adaptation plays an important or is one of the priorities of our administration when it comes to climate change action. While we contribute less than half of 1% to greenhouse gas emissions globally, we are continuing to work on mitigation efforts. But adaptation remains important because many of our local government units are on the coastlines, and they are the very first to bear the brunt of climate change impacts. In fact, this year we commemorate 10 years of Typhoon Haiyan. And that, for us, was a single turning point in the history of our country when it comes to making sure that our actions are science-based. More than anything, that particular event moved our policymakers to think that action should be science-based and data-driven. And in that regard, we have come up with a particular engagement process. We knew that the NAP, the very first that the Philippines will submit, is key, and that science will be the driving force. We didn't want politics to come in. We wanted to make sure, and the message to the people were, based on the guidance of our president, President Marcos, is that science will take out all of the politics and show us where the direction is going to be. So what we did for NAP is we came up with a consultative group of experts, which are the best of the best in the Philippines, from various experiences in both physical and social sciences, so that we get to understand not only the science of hazards, of what needs to be addressed to, but also the social impacts. So apart from that, the Climate Change Commission has worked very hard to make sure that our national panel of technical experts also cross-pollinate with this particular mechanism. You'd have to understand that for developing countries like the Philippines, the stability of these consultative mechanisms are key so that we continue to grow in adaptation abilities. So we've gone through the process, I think, in record time, about 8 months for the National Adaptation Plan. And we would be the only second country in Southeast Asia to provide the NAP. And what's key is that we're not just focusing on NAP and the adaptation projects, but we've gone ahead and made sure that there's a complementary process for financing NAP. And this is where what you said, if I can just dovetail the answer to your question, the importance of the role of the private sector. The Philippines, a very democratic country, very vibrant political space, make sure, and it's enshrined in our constitution, that we consult all of the sectors, CSOs, the academe, IPs, all of these. But increasingly, our business sector, the private sector, is having a larger footprint. They are joining in the consultation mechanisms that we have. The Climate Change Commission itself has undertaken a process by which we engage all of our stakeholders, particularly business, because we believe that any policies that we have will impact our businesses. They have a stake in this too. What we say is that investments, adaptation action and policies will have to be investment-led. it's because they are a key sector. They can invest in what we do. They can mobilize other funds that the government does not have. While we have increased our public investment into climate change action, weather adaptation and mitigation, to about 9% of our GDP, we recognize that our businesses can add so much more to that. So it's really a multiplication of the efforts and resources that we have. And truth to say, our businesses have their own science and technology and research and development units as well. And what we have that's good in the Philippines is that there is cross-pollination, and there is an increasing recognition of the need for us to address all issues related to climate change, which we consider as a global governance challenge of our generation, which is both global, historic, and systemic. Therefore, we need to have a one whole of government and the whole of society approach. And you see that here in COP28, the partnerships have proven to be working. And in our NAP, we expect the stronger voice of our private sector to filter in to the investments that are needed. And truth to tell, there's really a better sense of where we are right now in the Philippines and what we need to do because of the focus on science-based approach and data-driven approach. But also we have, I think, convinced successfully the private sector that it is not only in their interest, it's not only good business, but we've also touched on this important idea in the Philippines or value of bayanihan, which is your idea of building the nation together. And I think it's a very, very powerful approach. If you have the science down pat to show the direction, if you have the process to make sure that the process is inclusive, including the private sector, and if you have the values strong so that we have our multi-sectoral communities and stakeholders working together, I think that's a perfect recipe for success. And by and large right now, we're seeing a lot of successes in our local government units that are affected by climate change, but we are also seeing more and more of our private sector coming in and assisting us, and most importantly, being an important formal member of the NAP process, which is key for us to really integrate them and to ensure that the national adaptation plan becomes needs-based and accesses the resources that we need, whether public or private. And more than that, it will be able to mobilize other resources for capacity building. So, yeah.
Fantastic. That really does sound like best practice national adaptation planning.
I would have to add. I'm sorry. I hasten to add that it's not just a Philippine government approach. It's key that we partner with other development partners, and the Embassy of the United Kingdom has been crucial to this. We just want to say, and this is the principal position of the Philippines, we really are very strong on the delivery of MOIs and capacity building, technology development and transfer, and climate finance are key. And if this type of partnership with the UK Embassy, the UK government, can be shown to benefit the Philippines with all of our 110 million Filipinos affected, I think it shows the way whether to work in a multilateral setting or perhaps work at the bilateral setting so that these commitments of developed countries can be developed into something very real that benefits our people, who I would say desperately need the support that they can get. Because again, for us, it's an issue of climate justice. And then for us also, it's a question of scaling up and speeding up our adaptation projects so that we become a more adaptive country. Thank you.
Fantastic addition, and one I'm sure Vijay will pick up on in our second panel. FCDO have been very supportive of that NAP planning process. But you also said, as you gave that very eloquent answer there, Secretary Borge, that it was actually in the private sector's interest to do things in this space. And what better private sector company could we have than the third largest global CPG? And we have Jim Andrews, CSO of PepsiCo. And Jim, you source, you manufacture, you serve communities across the world, developed and developing world. And you're clearly facing climate changes in many of those geographies So again, you have two questions. The first one is, where and how are you investing in projects for PepsiCo's resilience? And secondly, how are you collaborating with the public sector on adaptation more generally? Because I know that you are.
Great. Thank you very much, and very much resonate with the comments of the Secretary. And so let me maybe build off them. In terms of, a big reason that we support adaptation is to help provide security and stability for the communities that we're active in and that we serve. And really that's so that we can continue to serve them, and so we can continue to provide the jobs that we provide in those communities. Also, to the point the Secretary made, adaptation is very directly related to providing resilience to our business. And so we recognize those things go hand in hand. And to thrive, we understand that we need to change what we do and how we do it all along the chain, Charmaine, that you were mentioning. And so we've launched a program a few years ago. We call it PepsiCo Positive, but it's really about how do we transform and put sustainability squarely at the center of everything we do. And a key pillar of that is around regenerative agriculture, which I think is really all about sustainability, about resilience, about adaptation, because we see every day. People think of PepsiCo as a very large beverage company, and of course we are. We're an even bigger food company. We're about 60% food. And so as we look at what goes on with crops around the world, and we're active in 200 countries and territories, the crops and the impact of climate change is very real every single day. And let me just give you an example. We use a lot of potatoes. Potatoes are very local. Can't move them very far. So we have farmers in a number of geographies that have seen yield decreases of up to a third directly because of climate change. That says adaptation, helping those farmers adapt to climate change, is very real, very now, and critically important to their livelihoods and to our ongoing business. And so, again, resonate very much with the Secretary's comments of this is very much good for business. It is also very good for the communities in which we operate. And we've launched, we do a lot of things. One thing we've done recently in partnership with governments, also with NGOs, is we launched a climate resilience platform that really provides for a huge number of geographies and crops what's going on with regards to climate change, how does it affect yields, and most importantly, what are the actions that can be taken? Because it's really about action that's going to help build resilience. The other question you asked was around partnerships and partnerships with governments, and I think that's critically important because many of the pathways to resilience require some risk, and I think they also require systemic change. Whether that's regen agriculture or recycling infrastructure or electrification or access to renewable electricity through offsite PPAs, right? The government has a critical role to play in that. And public-private partnerships help de-risk and also help rapidly scale and drive adoption. And let me just give you one example as I close. The United States Department of Agriculture had a smart commodities grant program, and it mobilized innovative approaches to adaptation to build resilience. We were involved in that, and it allowed us to crowd in other funds. But it started originally at $1 billion of grants. It was so successful that the government added another 1.8 billion, and it's really bringing in a way that de-risks and speeds acceleration and mobilizes large amounts of private capital and consortiums of companies. As you say, it's not just our business. We were talking at the beginning. It's everybody in a pre-competitive space that is in that area, and so that full ecosystem needs to move together. Governments and informed policy and the right policy frameworks, the right incentives can play a huge role in that, because all of us, I think, realize adapting to climate change, while yes, we're trying to mitigate it, but adapting to it to build resilience, absolutely critical to our business, but also critical to the countries that we operate in, the communities that we serve. And that's why it's so important both for us to do it, but then to do it in partnership with civil society and, importantly, governments.
fantastic. I mean, it's so encouraging to hear about companies like PepsiCo really seeking to drive adaptation at scale. That's what we need. We're at the foothills. We need to go up that experience curve. And you mentioned the US government, which takes me very nicely onto Brendan Owens. So Brendan is the CSO, the Chief Sustainability Officer of the Department of Defense at the US government. And as you can imagine, you have a lot of sites, you have a lot of assets, you have a lot of people in locations all across the world. And I'm interested to hear from you. Again, it's the two questions really. Is how are you planning to ensure resilience for all of those assets and communities and people? And how are you working with the private sector to do that? So over to you, Brendan.
Thanks very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I hope I can give a flavor of the scale of the challenge that US DoD is dealing with, because we do have installations all over the globe. We operate in the most extreme climates, both the hottest and the coldest. But I'd like to give you a few things to understand the scope and the scale of the challenge that DoD is facing. Just a couple of numbers to set the stage. In 2016, DoD, our National Guard in particular, spent 14,000 personnel days fighting wildfire in the continental United States. In 2021, we spent 176,000 personnel days fighting wildfire in the continental United States, a 12-fold increase. That is 482 years worth of time that these National Guards men and women were not training. This is an existential challenge for DoD. In addition to that, we have had 5 different billion-dollar-plus climate-driven disasters that have happened in the last decade. So again, while the top line of that is significant, billion-dollar disasters are not something that any organization can take lightly. The readiness impact of that is very real, and it is very tied to climate change. In response to that, in anticipation of that, I should say, one of the things that the Department of Defense has done is created a tool, the Defense Climate Assessment Tool, which is an installation-level geospatial climate-informed model of all of the installations all over the world. And what DCAD allows us to do is to look into the future and say, these are the climate vulnerabilities that we are going to experience. It's going to be wildfire in some places, it's going to be flooding, it's going to be hurricanes, it's going to be sea level rise. And again, the flavor of disaster that we are planning for, the flavor of climate change driven challenge that we are planning for is across the entire spectrum of challenges that we all know about. So the other thing that I'd like to sort of remark on to Jim's point is the fact that while the work that Pepsi is doing is supporting the community to support the business, our business doesn't function without the community. 70% of the people who work on military installations reside in the community. When the community is vulnerable to climate risk and disrupted by it, the military mission cannot be executed. So we have an obligation while we're doing those climate assessments of the fence line, within the fence line, to also understand the risks to the personnel that live in the community outside the fence line. So that public-private collaboration is a significant opportunity to make sure that we are taking resilient steps that extend the capability beyond the fence line into the community because of that mission continuity requirement. And I'll just drill down on one specific place that we're doing that from a public-private partnership perspective, and that's energy. We are partnering with energy services companies to do energy savings performance contracts to make sure that we are delivering all of the energy efficiency and load reduction strategies that we can. Our installations are significant load pockets for most of the utility service territories that they are in, which means that we are, in a lot of instances, the number one user of electricity, of gas, of water in that place. So anything that we can do to lower our demand on any of those utilities increases resilience for the community itself. So that's number one. In addition to that, we are taking advantage of the fact that we have mandates from our our administration to increase the investments that we're making in carbon-free electricity. So while we are electrifying our non-tactical vehicle fleet and seeking to leverage the storage capacity of the electric vehicles that we are bringing onto our installations, we are also making sure that we are making investments off the installation in the procurement and the spend that we are making with our electricity procurement to make sure that we are driving new renewable generation on the grid. So in the interest of time, the last thing that I will say is that we have this coming both from the president on down through the Secretary of Defense. Secretary Austin, my boss, is very clear about his priorities. He puts out every year a letter to the force, and the first thing that is in the letter to the force is always defend the nation. That's the mission of DoD. The second thing is take care of our people. The third thing is succeed through partnership, and he means that. He really does mean that. So the partnership opportunities that we are engaging in through energy savings, through CFE procurement, all of that public-private partnership is driving significant amounts of change, and it is all being informed by our climate risk and vulnerability. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brendan. I think it really gave us insight into the developed world to some extent, as well as how you're working so closely with the private sector. We're moving down that chain, and we're now moving towards financing, project portfolios and financing. And I'm really delighted that we have Jay Coe with us today. He's MD of Lightsmith, who's one of the leading investors in adaptation. And he has some great lessons to share with us on these two topics of some of the adaptation projects you're involved with and your perspective on what works best in terms of public and private collaboration. Thank you, Jay.
Sharma, just delighted to be here, and so wonderful to see so many people at the Resilience Hub. Overall, I mean, resilience and adaptation, I think, are really becoming more of the focus of the COP and the broader community because of necessity, but also because I think there's people that have leadership like BCG and others in really driving the agenda forward. So it's wonderful to be here on that basis. As mentioned, Lightsmith is the first private investment fund for adaptation and climate resilience, and we're focused on technologies that can help enable both communities, companies, countries, anyone to really understand how the path of physical risk and impact of climate change will occur and how to manage that risk. So the question was about public-private collaboration in this point, and I want to make just probably three specific points. The first is there are real investment opportunities in addition to risks for adaptation and climate resilience. It is not true that there is no business model for adaptation and there's no future for adaptation, there's no investability in adaptation. We are investing right now in the first fund for adaptation, the Craft Fund at Lightsmith, and we are very pleased today to announce that our fourth investment in Cadmus, which is a strategic and technical advisory and execution firm that has expertise in physical climate risk, in the energy transition, in water, in the environment. They do a lot of work with utilities, similar to the work that you just described, Brendan, for the US DoD, that every organization is going to be looking at in terms of their supply chain, in terms of water. They do it all over the world, and so the CEO, Ian Klein, is right there. And that brings our fund, the first fund for climate resilience and adaptation, to north of 50% invested. So we are looking forward to scaling that up. That fund is a blended finance vehicle itself. It's a combination of investors that include the Green Climate Fund, to AXA Insurance, to the Rockefeller Foundation and individual family offices. So the sources of capital come from multiple places. And at the same time, the uses of that capital are to find technologies that are in the private sector, both in developed country and in developing countries. So the point about the agricultural supply chain, one of our other companies, Solimftech, is a Brazil-based precision agriculture company. They network together the production of food. They cover over 90% of the supply chain, the sugarcane production in India. And by networking that together, they can reduce water usage, they can use fertilizer usage, fuel usage, pesticide usage that drops GHGs, increases the productivity, and makes those production of food much more resilient to the effects of climate change. They deploy weather sensors, humidity sensors. This is how we're going to manage the increasingly volatile conditions going forward in the real economy and provide food security to lots of people. In addition to that, the other thing that we need to talk about here is the work we're doing with the public sector is also extremely important with very vulnerable populations that need resiliency, as Razan said, the champion said earlier today. They need resiliency in their communities today, not later on. So the fund that we have, the Craft Fund at Lightsmith, is investing in commercial technologies for commercial returns to demonstrate that there is an investment case for adaptation. But we recognize at the same time There are vulnerable populations today in low-income countries and small island development states that need that technology not 10 years from now when it will become affordable for them, but right now. So last year we announced that we had a technical assistance facility for grants that enabled us to deploy technology from a company called Source Global that we've invested in. Those are solar hydro panels. These generate pure drinking water from the air and sunlight, 50 countries around the world. And we took $500,000 from the US government and the Nordic Development Fund and piloted those panels to deliver water in Papua New Guinea to a school and a local community that had never had piped drinking water before. They literally boat the water in to give school children water, and if they can't get the boat there that day, the school children don't go to school. We're very happy to announce at this COP, with the support of that facility from the State Department of the US and with the Nordic Development Fund, that we're deploying that technology in Vanuatu and Tonga, right, to expand and provide that technology today, right, to pilot the technology today in places that otherwise will be overlooked by the commercial sector. So there are many models where the public and private sector can kind of work together. The two last things I would leave you with are this. One, as we've reached over the 50% deployment threshold in the first CRAFT fund, what we now see is the visibility on billions of dollars of potential technologies and opportunities that we can think of that will support adaptation and resilience for governments, for communities, for companies, for individuals. And we think that the next CRAFT fund, the CRAFT Plus successor to this fund, could be up to $1 billion of that deployed capital and extending into new areas like healthcare diagnostics, for example. It's great to see health here at the COP because we're seeing changes in disease incidence because of climate change. We're all talking about the Pakistan floods this time last year, displacement of about a third of the country, 1,700 children, 1,700 people killed, over half of them children. And this year, there's an additional 2.1 million malaria cases in Pakistan because of that. 5 million additional cases on the planet because of climate change. It's not a future problem, it's a today problem. So the technology for healthcare diagnostics will help us understand that we need to scale that and bring that everywhere. The last thing I would say, and I know I'm over time a little bit, is we have called today for the recognition of certain principles here in Dubai. Why can't Dubai, in the context of the narrative of the climate talks, stand for speed? For speed of action. The latest reports are there's only $1.3 billion of private investment in adaptation. It's the highest it's ever been tracked. But on that trajectory, by 2030, we'll not even reach $3 billion of mobilized private investment. Okay, and that's only 6.5 years from now. And according to UNEP, the latest numbers is the need will be $387 billion for developing countries alone by 2030. So that's 125 times as much resource needs to be mobilized than the amount that we're on the current slope of the curve to get to. We need to bend the curve on that mobilization. We need to accelerate the speed by which we actually make these investments and move forward together between the public and private sector. So the challenge we're issuing is a Dubai adaptation billions challenge, ABC. And it suggests there's only 3 things that you should think about. Can we not agree that we should A, accelerate? We should make decisions within a year instead of like indefinitely, and do it together between the public and private sector. So by COP29, instead of saying, oh, it's so sad that adaptation finance is now $1.4 billion, which is probably where the trajectory is, that we actually come here with many, many more billions of approved commitments. Let's get through our evaluation and decision-making process within 1 year. That's the accelerate part. B is blend. We need to blend different types of finance and capital, philanthropic capital, public capital, government capital, impact capital, private sector institutional investment capital together. And we also need to blend our process. In the United States, if you're applying to 12 colleges, you don't have to write now 12 applications. You're at a single common application. Can we not agree in an emergency, which the climate crisis is, we should all get together and try to work together at the same time and blend our expertise, blend our capital, blend our process so we can get that acceleration done. So A, accelerate, B, blend, and C, commit. Commit, so that when you're not sitting here in 1 year from now, or at COP35, if there is such a thing in 2030, saying, wow, isn't it sad that the slope of the curve never changed, and now we're 125 times less than we ought to be, and the results of that are dramatic. So I'm wearing my track shoes here at the COP, because I think the world should be focused on speed. If we want to get to scale, we need to have speed. And if we don't, the challenge is that, to your point about we're in the foothills, we need to climb the mountain, the size of the mountain gets bigger every day we don't climb higher. It's very unusual, right? What is clear is the slower it takes us to adapt, to invest money in proactive adaptation, because we will adapt ex ante or ex post. The ex post means a lot of lives are lost in that transition. And the faster we get technology for geospatial, the faster we get technology for managing the supply chain, for food security, for water security, for the future, the faster we have a chance to protect our children and the next generation from what we have set up for them, right? So why can we not join hands, accelerate, blend, commit? You know, the craft strategy has proven out you can make profitable investments in adaptation. It took us a long time to raise that fund. We need to go a lot faster. There's billions of dollars of adaptation investment opportunity out there. Investors are looking at it. We should join hands and move forward on that basis. Thank you for taking too much time.
ABC it is. Thank you so much, Jay. I think we just have a few moments for questions to this panel, because unfortunately, one of our panelists on the second panel is sick, so I think we do have a little bit of time. So.
Is that on? Okay, hi. Yeah, I've heard that we're on a tight timeline, but I still want to open the floor to one or two questions you have to our dear panelists, if there are any. Yes, over there.
Hi, thanks very much for the panel. My name is Danielle Boyd from the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. I'd like to ask a representative from the government of the Philippines to talk a little bit more about how you're bringing private finance institutions or the private sector more broadly into that process for developing the NAP, and if you've had any successes that you can share.
Thank you. For the National Adaptation Plan, it was really part of the process that we have an interdisciplinary as well as intersectoral consultations. That is the key word and principle that the government under President Marcos is doing. We hold a lot of multi-stakeholder consultations, and it was a key feature of the National Adaptation Plan. But apart from that, it's also part of the engagement of the Climate Change Commission. And what we've done is that we've formalized for the first time, our engagement with the business sector. And it's an ongoing consultation every year that we hold. We recently had our Climate Change Consciousness Week. And what's important in the process is that we bring them in, we listen to them, and we look for recommendations on policies. For the first time, we've had 4 of the major companies, the biggest companies in the Philippines, committing to work with the Philippine government on adaptation and mitigation efforts. And present were their sustainability officers. And this is just the first of many steps that we have. You'd have to understand that there are many ways by which the private sector have gone ahead and invested. But I think the approach was very one-off and very focused on their own communities where the businesses are. What we see in the Philippines right now is that it is changing, because they realize that when they invest even outside of their own areas, outside of their own communities, it redounds to their own benefit. My point here is that the mechanism, the architecture has to be there for this type of approach to thrive. And we want this to be stronger and more resilient, if I can borrow the word, a more resilient engagement process with our business and the private sector. And this is the direction that we're going, and we hope to further grow it as the years go by, and especially because we're working on the NDC implementation plan as well. So a lot of things that need investment in the Philippines, and we know that public investment will not be enough, and we're looking forward to deeper engagement by our private sector. Thank you.
Much, dear panelists. We have to move on to the next panel and to David, my colleague, and financing and implementation. I found it truly insightful. I learned a lot. Most of my questions were answered. So hopefully we meet at the reception afterwards. Thank you.
Well, thank you to the first set of panelists. And we're delighted to invite our second group. We're going to shift gears. We're going to move from planning, portfolio, to financing and implementation. And if I just take the bookends of the previous discussion, Charmian mentioned we are at the foothills, so there's a lot more to go. And Jay mentioned, we need a lot of speed, right? And the curve is nowhere close to where it needs to be. And recognizing that we are still, early in what we need to do in financing and scaling what needs to be done. We have a fantastic group of panelists on financing and implementation. The governor of Lagos sends his apologies. He's fallen ill, so he's unable to join us, and wish him well. Hopefully he gets well soon. So I'd love to start, Vijay, with you from the FCDO perspective. So FCDO has taken a very advanced position on adaptation, supporting many countries, partnering in many countries, as Secretary Borge had mentioned, with the Philippines, and really pushing that agenda quite early on. And perhaps from your vantage point, if you could share where you're starting to see the best examples of public and private mobilization. And a second question related to that, what role development finance institutions such as yourselves can play to catalyze and accelerate financing and implementation of adaptation?
Thank you very much, Dave. And thanks for having me on this panel. That was a really good panel before, actually. I learned a lot. It feels to me, just having done COP26, COP27, and previous ones actually, the emphasis on private sector investment to adaptation has suddenly gone up a notch and is going to accelerate massively. This feels like the debate that we had 10, 15 years ago on mitigation, and it's now going, which is great. So you've got a brilliant, and thank you, Charmian, we've got a brilliantly timed panel. So let me just answer your questions a bit direct. I mean, there is clearly a massive finance, an adaptation finance gap. We all know it. I won't set it out. And that's why, fundamentally, we are putting quite a lot of effort into it. Secretary Borge talked about the stuff we're doing in the Philippines. We're doing that in many countries around the world. For me, in FCDO, almost all our money, public money, is going into adaptation. We don't really need to do much in mitigation now anymore. Quite a lot into nature, which I will put as the subject for next year's panel, if I can suggest it, because that one is even one step behind. But all of our money is basically going on as much leverage as we can possibly get, because the only way that we're going to actually fill that adaptation gap is by bringing in a lot of private sector finance and expertise and leveraging. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I ran an event on Saturday on what are the investable opportunities on climate. And a lot of that came out to be climate resilient crops, innovative early warning systems. I was just going through my notes of it. And I'll come with one particular example, which is cold storage in East Africa, in Kenya. Really interesting about just an example. First of all, just take a step back. I think there is an absolute necessity for the public sector, governments in particular, to set the right enabling environment for this. Now, Secretary Borge said a lot of what I was going to say. It's the national action plans and so on. It is making sure that government regulation allows that kind of blended finance. It doesn't always. And it is actually setting a very clear direction as to what to invest in. So we've been doing a lot of work, for example, on the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, Task Force on Access to Climate Finance. And giving a good example of a country that's doing it really well, Jamaica. Minister Salmuda was speaking, I think, yesterday, saying, here are the things that we would like you to invest in. And gave a very clear list, good long-term perspective, and the right backing. So get the context right. Second, support the institutional investors. And we need some better metrics to address physical climate risk and adaptation benefit, particularly the wider adaptation benefit. We've announced about £3 million to try to take forward that analytical work, but given the brains and expertise in the room, here is my challenge towards all of you, which is how do we actually calculate credibly the adaptation co-benefits of some of these programs? That is an unsolved problem. We are solving one by one some of the more difficult analytical problems, like what is a net zero city? I think we've got somewhere on that. This one we don't yet have an answer to. I think we need one. I wanted to focus on 4 institutions, and I'll give a couple of examples within those that I think answer your question. So the first is we need to build a pipeline and overcome some of the early stage risk. Now, the institution I want to focus on is called PIDGE, the Private Infrastructure Development Group in the UK. It takes 5 countries' money and blends it all together, right? And puts it into programs. We're putting another 400 million in, by the way, because it's one of the best investments I have got on my entire portfolio. I mean, for that kind of few hundred million, it gets 27 billion of private sector funding in, which is a leverage rate to die for, if you're talking about the blending rate. It's now only investing in projects that support climate mitigation a bit, but adaptation and resilience. So it's finding those, and it is actually developing a really good pipeline. So look at their website. There's lots of good investments there. But I say, I think probably my single best program at the moment. Second one is called the Emerging Markets Climate Action Fund. And I have to read that because it's slightly long, but it's basically run by Allianz Global Investors and the EIB. And what that is doing, and here's a good example, is agri-tech and things like cold storage. So we've put another 9 million in at this COP, but I just want to give an example of how this then works. They have attracted about 350 million of private sector commitments, Folksam, Allianz, and so on, and are going to spend quite a lot of that in Kenya and East Africa, building a cold chain infrastructure. Now, why? Because higher temperatures, major losses out of all the crops in Kenya, actually, and severe weather events. I think at the moment our estimate is 30 to 50% of production is lost along supply chains. 30 to 50% of all production is lost, right? Imagine the benefits, the wide co-benefits, if you fix all of that. You also increase productivity, lower soil degradation through overplanting, which people do, and lowers the methane emissions dramatically. This is a real multiple win. And so what we're doing is trying to build a cold chain, which is about 100 million scale, 7 or 8 facilities, capacity 65,000 pallets a day. And it will also be very helpful should we ever, God forbid, have another pandemic where you do need a cold chain to get your vaccines in. Building things like that are multiple help for resilience. So that is a 10% public, 90% private, totally commercial, majorly profit-making, resilience-focused solution. And that's the sort of thing I think we should be looking at. Finally, briefly, 2 other institutions, the Green Climate Fund, GCF, doing great work on this. Again, I think the MUFG Gaia Fund is going for a $1.5 billion worth of investments on adaptation. So I think the dial is actually shifting. I think the speed, in response to your point, the speed is coming. I think just our investments alone are going to be at the multiple, quite a few £billion level by the time we get to 2 COPs away, and I'm sure other governments around the world are going to be doing exactly the same. So very briefly on your development finance point, the World Bank is really key. We need their climate development reports. I'd flag also the Global Centre on Adaptation and what the African Development Bank are doing. And they're beginning to develop this concept of the Adaptation Compact, which is something terribly specific that says, please invest here to do this, and this is why it fits in with my national plan. So it comes under the National Action Plan. But that's a really useful signal as to what a government is trying to bake in and where the investment should go. We are trying to, with BII, which is the UK's development finance institution, we are trying to focus very heavily on water infrastructure and resilience. And I think that's going to be about the £200 million level for our own funding going in over a 5-year period. So I think all of these together, they're moving beyond proof of concept, and they're moving beyond pilot projects. We're moving to deep scale up now. We would welcome lots of other governments and private sector allies in that journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. Very encouraging examples that you shared, and also a wide range of problems and solutions needed, which calls for the best of the private sector and many others to come to the fore. I mean, picking up from where you left off, I want to shift to Mark from from a pure private sector perspective. Mark, you lead investments in AIA. You have huge interest across the globe, but a huge exposure in Asia. And we all know Asia is highly exposed to physical risk and also is challenged. Many countries are challenged with the capacity to adapt. So from your standpoint, with this vast investment portfolio across many interests and many sectors and many assets, how do you think about the exposure to physical risk you have in AIA? And when you think about that, also looking ahead, where do you start to see the potential for more public and private mobilization around responding to this?
Thanks, Dave. Maybe give you a little bit of a private sector perspective. So we're a life insurer and health insurer. We're spread out across Asia, 18 markets, over 100 years operating in the region. We have in our region the most vulnerable communities that are exposed to climate change, as we know. We also have a region which is starved of funding. And I think, as the previous panel highlighted, there's a lot going on at the governmental level. As a life insurer, we are liability driven. So there's a perception that, we manage $250 billion US. There's a perception that this money is freely available to take risk and try and promote development and use it as development capital. It clearly is not. Our primary responsibility is to our policyholders and make sure that we deliver back to them on the liabilities, on our commitments to them over 25, 35, 40 years. But when it comes to thinking about our role within adaptation and development, we have a small amount of capital that is available to take more risk. And these tend to focus on new ventures. We do a little bit on impact, working with partners such as Leapfrog, which go out into communities and bring technology and technology-driven solutions to connect people either through energy provision or through mobile technology that gives them access to banking. So in a small way, we participate there. We also participate in venture capital, and we look at things like biotech, which has significant opportunities for growth. But the primary responsibility there is driven by profit motive, to look at ventures that can generate revenue and ultimately pay back capital with interest or with upside. I think the big opportunity, though, if we can unlock it, and we've talked on several panels over the last few days, is we have a huge demand for long-dated securities. If we can find investment opportunities that give returns linked to long-term interest rates, then you're hitting the 85% of our book. So when it comes to public partnerships, if we can structure some of those deals, and I think look at the offtake and work with governments and deal with some of the short-term risks, which Vijay has just highlighted, I think there's a real discussion to have, and I think insurance companies can clearly play a role if we can change the model of the financing and get insurance companies to participate, but address the main bulk of their book, which is the long-term nature. If we can link returns to long-term interest rates, then I think there's a real opportunity. And we have a moral obligation and an obligation to our policyholders and the communities where we operate, because one of the things we do is we mobilize private savings, we aggregate, and we reapply them into the economies where we operate. We're big participants in the public debt markets across all 18 markets where we operate. We're trying to build out the term structure of interest rates so that we can provide long-term insurance contracts to our policyholders, which does take out some of the near-term risk for them and allow them to apply their own savings in a more productive way. So I think there's a lot to do, but I think the discussions really are only scratching the surface in trying to come up with private-public partnerships that are much more progressive. And we look at things that have been done historically in Australia, albeit in a developed market scenario. There are still some structures there which are quite useful and quite indicative of how we might be looking to partner with the public sector going forward.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Mark. And it's encouraging to hear also that you're thinking about these issues long term, given in the markets that you operate and how deeply interlinked they are for your own long term viability. I want to shift a bit to the implementation end, to Hanan. In OCP, you're doing a lot of innovative things. You're working in agriculture, water, many areas that require resilient solutions and adaptation. And if I could ask you perhaps to share from your vantage point some of the best examples of this intersection where public and private have come together to deliver solutions and you've managed to scale them. Thank you, Hanan.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here with you and to share a bit about my company's work, especially regarding adaptation and resilience in the agricultural sector. First of all, maybe I have to introduce OCP. OCP is a Moroccan company. We are the world leading company in fertilizer production and export. With us, we have clients and subsidiaries all over the world with a special dedication to Africa, where we have more than 70% of the market share. And our phosphate reserves are a little bit, let's say, our duty for the world, because in Morocco we have access to 75% of the world reserves. So we ensure to use these reserves with the maximum of stewardship and responsibility toward the world and making fertilizers available for all these communities. So maybe before answering your question, I have to step back and take a look to the overall challenge. We know that the population in the world is increasing. We will face a population of more than 9 billion people by 2050, needing to feed this population. This leads to a potential of food increase up to 50% compared to what we have today. And this revolution cannot be done without fertilization and without giving back to the soil what is taken by agricultural intensification. At the same time, we have also the nexus of climate. We need to solve the climate change issue. The Paris Agreement is appealing for being neutral by 2050. And those two objectives seems to be contradictory. But there is a way to achieve this agricultural revolution and food increase while even unlocking the potential of soils as a carbon sink. Today, the soils contain more than 3 times the carbon that is contained in the atmosphere and could even capture more if agriculture is embracing the good practices and the smart agricultural practices that enable soils to unlock this potential of carbon capture. So at OCP, we are working on that. We first of all work on the quantity of fertilizers. We need to make fertilizers available for the world. And then we work also on quality. What kind of fertilizers we are, let's say, providing to our clients that are the end user farmer and the smallholder farmer everywhere. So we all over these last years, we worked on what we call the customization, or making tailored fertilizers that respond to the exact need of soils all over the African continent especially. We used to produce only 4 or 5 types of fertilizers, but today we produce more than 50 types. Each one is adapted to the crop and the soil that is used for. We started by doing a big, let's say, recognition of soils in more than 20 countries in Africa, trying to analyze soils and to find out what are the gaps, the nutrient gaps. These soils maybe need sometimes more sulfur, more borium than nitrogen and fertilizer that everyone is bringing on the market. And then we developed these fertilizers for Ethiopian soils, for coffee, for maize, it's a very complex combination that led to increasing yields, sometimes up to 40% more with the same surface. And this is very important. This is how you can work on providing more food without, let's say, deforesting more land and using the maximum of the potential of these soils to produce food. So Africa is key to solve this challenge. You know that more than 60% of the Arab lands in the world are in Africa. But there are also many challenges to face all over the whole value chain and the whole system of the agricultural value chain. First of all, affordability. Farmers don't have this means to buy fertilizers and buy these plant nutrition solutions all the time. Accessibility as well. There are lots of challenges to solve around the logistics and the distribution channels and so on. Sometimes even crop insurance, the access to markets, all these are big questions to rise. And then how to train farmers to use these tailored solutions with the best way, and how to train them and to increase capabilities to implement the good practices for carbon capture and for solving this issue of climate change and, let's say, turning the soil and the agricultural sector to a net negative sector when it comes to carbon. So this is why at OCP we had to work on all these components, and we cannot do it without, let's say, implementing partnerships with public and private partners from several, let's say, disciplines like technology disciplines, training, universities, and financial as well. So this is a systemic change that's required from us to work with different partnerships and several institutions. I can name some of them. We just announced, for example, our IFC cooperation with IFC to set up a blended finance platform for farmers. This platform will enable farmers all over more than 30 agricultural value chains to embrace these practices and to solve all these bottlenecks that I talked about, and will bring more than $800 million of blended capital with several institutions, partners, etc. Will help these farmers to even move from their very basic activities to more value food production and create more local value even for them. The second maybe partnership that I would like to highlight is what we announced in October during the World Bank annual meetings that have been held in Morocco, in Marrakesh. And we just signed a partnership with the World Bank to help more than 5 million farmers all over the African continent to access to these solutions and to access also to financial tools like, as I told you, crop insurance, the access to markets, etc. This will enable 5 million farmers to improve their livelihoods and the conditions that they are facing today in terms of agricultural affordability. Maybe I have also to highlight the fact that my company engaged to provide like sustainable solutions and sustainable carbon neutral fertilizers for the whole world. So today we have an objective of being carbon neutral by 2040, including our direct and indirect emissions. And this requires also investing in our core business operations. So we are building on some existing, let's say, competitive advantages when it comes to electricity that we use. For example, more than, let's say, about 90% of the electricity is clean, coming from renewables and cogeneration and so on. But we engaged in an investment of more than 1.2 gigawatt of solar farms to cover the remaining need of electricity for our operations. The first step is already launched with the IFC. So we are investing in more than 400 megawatt farms today. And this is just to highlight that even for our core operations, we are in need always to develop partnerships and multi-stakeholders engagements for that. For water, since we were talking also about the water issue, Morocco is facing a big water crisis. It's one of the most stressed countries in the world when it comes to water scarcity. I think the 21st in the world. And we decided several years ago to decouple our production capacity increase from the consumption of water, or what we call surface water or natural water. So we substituted all the water that we take from dams, from rivers and so on, but our own produced water using desalination provided by clean energy, and also wastewater. So we had to recover wastewater from towns and communities around us. We built now already three plants of wastewater treatment, and we are also implementing 4 additional plans. And this kind of partnerships you need to have with you, the state, the local institutions, the population that is using this water, the investors. So it's a great example how you need to bring all over all these partners around the table and make them align on the same objective in order to achieve the project. So this kind of project is a real example how partnerships are absolutely necessary to be resilient and to invest in such community engagement plans that are really impactful and long-lasting value. So in the end, I would like just to say, if it is one of the SDGs, this means that we cannot achieve the other ones without partnerships. This is very important, and we are fully convinced with that at OCP. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hanan, and it really resonated what you shared. These examples were fantastic. You know, these multiple objectives being met: mitigation and adaptation in the food system. For business reasons, increasing your resilience on water, which also helps the rest of the country and the community. It's really fantastic examples. Now, thank you for sharing with all our panelists. I think we have some time for some questions as well. I'll hand to Annika.
I think we're already coming to the end, but want to open the floor to pose 1 or 2 questions, please.
My name is Ali and I'm from Pakistan. Thank you for excellent 2 sessions on the speed and now on scale. And there have been huge investments in maladaptation in my country and many other countries that I've worked. These investments in maladaptations far exceed investments in adaptation and resilience. The question is just the way the gentleman spoke about ABC. Vijay, it's a question to you. Is there any XYZ that when we go on scale, the private sector investments are not investments in maladaptation? Thank you.
I think first of those is knowing what maladaptation looks like. Now, there's several different forms of this. One of them, and we're seeing this in the insurance industry quite significantly, is a misperception of climate risk. Now, some of the destructions that we saw, for example, in the floods in Pakistan were a good example where major investments that we, the Pakistani government, many others had made over the last years were basically just destroyed. And we're having to rebuild, particularly take some of the schools. That was partly, I don't think, a misperception of risk, but just a miscalculation of risk. We didn't understand how great, how quickly, and how large the damage was going to be. So the first thing I'd say is, I don't imagine that anyone in either the private or public sector wants to put an investment in and then have it basically just wiped out in a couple of years. So first, can we understand? And that's why we're putting quite a lot of work into the localized weather mapping prediction and the integration of that data into particularly local government planning. I mean, just to give you, and some countries are beginning to do this brilliantly. The place I've so far seen it, I mentioned Jamaica, but give you a second example. The only place I've yet seen full-scale forward climate local modeling being used in local government planning is in Chennai, in Madras, where they have got a brilliant little team of fantastic scientists. They have mapped exactly what's going to happen. They have a if this then what model. You can plug it in. I'm going to put a jetty here. It's going to silt up here as sea level rises. Put a school here. It'll be 10 degrees hotter than the school there. They build a school there. We can't do that in the UK, by the way. Not a single one of our local authorities is yet able to use that climate modeling. We've really got to do it. And you've got to do it everywhere in the world. So the more we can actually get people using that, the less maladaptation will happen. And then final thought a bit is, and this comes back to the challenge I laid out earlier, can we understand what the intrinsic cost should be and how we should cost avoided damage and avoided loss? It's quite, I mean, the Dutch have been doing this for a while, interestingly. They will cost the lives and livelihoods saved. There's a rather famous example where in southern Netherlands there was some heavy rainfall. On the Dutch side of the border, it was inconvenient. On the German side of the border, same place, I think 5 people died and about 100 million euro worth of investment was wiped out. Why was that? It's because the Dutch, for years, decades, in fact, pretty well a century, have been doing water resilient adaptation very carefully and investing about €1 billion a year very steadily in that. They cost it. They have the Dutch parliament is famously acute when it comes to the efficacy of their spend. So they just cost out how that works. And we currently lack, and this comes to your point on Malat, we lack a retail grasp of what adaptation actually means. I would say it's a phrase like saving lives and livelihoods, and you can cost the saving lives and cost the saving livelihoods. But how that then translates into the actual investment by governments and by companies, we don't yet really know that. And that, the global goal and adaptation being discussed in the rooms around here now, useful. It's not going anywhere near there at the moment. And I think we have to move beyond that into what does this actually mean for actual economic actors, both in terms of the data and that costing. And that way we will prevent a lot of maladaptation.
Thank you, Vijay, for the answer to that very relevant question. Before we come to an end and reconvene at the networking session, I would like to invite Nathaniel Matthews, the CEO of the Global Resilience Hub, our host today, on stage to come with the final words.
Jump back to this one. That's great. Thanks very much. Yeah, so I'm the CEO of the Global Resilience Partnership and one of the managing partners of the Resilience Hub. And so thank you first to all the fantastic panelists and BCG and Razan. I recognize that I'm standing between you and canapes and maybe other events, so I'll try to be very brief here. It's hard to close such a rich discussion, but I have a few quick reflections. So we all know that now that we're in the midst of a polycrisis, and without robust adaptation and resilience efforts, we will completely derail all of our efforts on mitigation. So that's clear. I was a climate scientist who's an optimist, but who also worries a lot. It was really music to my ears to hear the comments on science, on the NAPs, on engaging in systems, on talking about agriculture, which is a key place that we need to transform from a net source to a net sink if we're to get anywhere near our climate targets. And also the role of tech and transformative investments, and the great work that Jay's doing, of course, in there. And also really the point from Vijay around measurement and evidence needing to be more robust. I think that's also really critical, what we can demonstrate here. The role of insurance, water, and soil, all really, really clear. GRP was formed 10 years ago, and it was pretty lonely to be an organization focused on adaptation and resilience 10 years ago, but it's changed a lot. These are conversations that were unimaginable even 2 years ago. And so I think our running shoes are on, Jay, but we need to go faster for sure. And I think, for us, we built our base off of our connectivity and credibility with grassroots organizations, but now we've really recognized that need to engage, of course, with the science, but also in the public-private partnerships, as this panel and discussion really, really highlighted so well. We're the implementing partner of the Prepare Call to Action, where we're bringing together over 24 companies to advance climate adaptation and resilience from the private sector. And with BCG and USAID, and led very much by BCG, we have a report coming out on the 6th, which highlights and really gets into the business case for adaptation and resilience in emerging markets and developing economies. So I'd really ask you, if you have time, it's 2:30 at the US Center. It'll be launched with John Kerry and Samantha Power. That's a powerful report that gets into the quantitative numbers, benefit cost ratios, and others of the business case for this, because this is the biggest economic transition in our lives, in our history as humans, but it's also the biggest opportunity, and we're thrilled to be a part of that. And so just in closing, I would just say that resilience and adaptation is all about systems. We heard that from the panelists, and systems are complex, but let's not get stuck in that complexity. Let's use the technology that we have today, the partnerships that are here and the willingness for those, the local and diverse sets of knowledge we have to navigate and embrace this complexity. And let's not let the complexity derail the pace and ambition that we need to move forward. Thank you.